Get out. Please, I need the police help. My mum is alive. No.
Tell me where you are.
In England and Wales, 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence over their lifetime. On average, 2 women a week are killed at the hands of abuse.
This is a global epidemic that, we all need to do something about in order to stop it happening.
But what most of us don't know is the threat that life-saving refuges are under if proposed cuts go ahead.
That can't be a solution for, a cancer that exists in our nation.
I want to investigate just how crucial refuges are and what will happen to the women and children that could be turned away.
If that refuge accommodation is no longer available to women in the area, that is really, really concerning in terms of what will happen to those women.
At the time, it was my only option. I didn't have family that I could go to.
This was the world's first women's refuge, founded in 1971. It was a safe house for women and children fleeing domestic violence. It was estimated that 25,000 families were suffering abuse. However, there was no government department to provide care. The demand for Chiswick Refuge was so high, the number of residents often reached the high 70s, and yet no new arrivals were ever turned away. But today is a different story. Last year, 60% of women who sought refuge were refused due to lack of bed space. Now, 1 in 2 survivors are turned away from a refuge, with funding dropping almost £10 million in the last 7 years. But the struggle for these women could get much worse. At the end of last year, the government released a proposal that would see the housing benefit removed from the welfare system. This means that women can no longer pay for refuge accommodation using the housing benefit, a vital source of income for refugees. Instead, there were plans to ring-fence funding, meaning local councils will decide where the money goes, potentially leaving refugees with nothing. To put it simply, these changes could lead to 39% of refuges closing for good, 13% having to reduce bed space, and 4,000 women and children being turned away. But it's not just those running the refuges that will feel the effects of these cuts. Social housing plays a key role in identifying abuse and referring victims to refuge services. I want to see how the proposed cuts will change the way housing providers deal with victims of domestic violence. I went to speak to Goody, who leads the domestic violence response at Peabody, one of the biggest social housing providers in the UK.
As a housing provider, we are not a specialist service. We have got independent domestic violence advisors that work in our specialist community safety team, which is a great source of expertise and knowledge. However, when we're working with our residents at a local level, we need to be able to refer them to specialist services or to refuge in emergency situations. As the cuts kick in, it makes it increasingly difficult to refer to those specialist services on the local level to ensure the women, men and children that we are working with get the vital specialist service that they need in order to support them, but also help them rebuild their lives essentially. We're seeing real difficulty in actually getting people referred through to refuge accommodation because there's just not enough space for all the people that need it. The other way that you might access refuge accommodation is via local level. If you went to your local authority, they could potentially support you to access refuge accommodation as part of their housing advice that they would give you, because they owe a duty to anyone that's suffering domestic abuse to at least provide them advice and guidance about how they would be able to flee safely.
I decided it was time to speak to someone who was a victim of abuse. Brenda suffered for 2 years before making the brave decision to leave her home.
We've been married for 45 years and I was 74 at the time. And my husband became abusive. Not violent, but words, which I think you carry the scar longer than a bruise would heal or whatever. And looking back, I could see the start of the horrible things, and then it really got. And he would always border on that edge of, was he going to lose it? And I just wanted somebody to tell me, was there something wrong with him? What was going on with his head? And he started on me where this man was, and he said, look at her. Look at that woman, her age. Have you seen that? You know, just... And it went on, and he's getting... And this guy said to me, I need you to go into your bedroom and I need you to pack. I can't let you stay here. I can't guarantee your safety.
The abuse for Brenda soon became too much. But thankfully, she had a support system around her which meant she didn't have to go into refuge. I wondered if the circumstances were different, would she have had to?
As regards going into a refuge, I think I would have got so low. But for them not to be there, I tried to think what happened to some of them.
Would your decision have been different if you had younger children, do you think? Would you have left sooner? Or would you...
Oh, I would definitely have left sooner, and I would have gone into a refuge. End of. For a mother, and having children, your first job is to protect your children, and where do you go? You have to go to a refuge. That's, you know, they're the people that are going to take you out of the situation.
But the path to refuge isn't that simple, especially if the government's plans go ahead, leaving women across the country unable to pay for refuge. Somebody who knows that all too well is Labour MP Jess Phillips.
According to the Women's Aid annual survey last year, on one single day, there were 132 women aged 18 to 20 living in refuge after being attacked, assaulted, and in some cases raped. Will the Chancellor today guarantee for me and those women that those living in supported accommodation, like refuge, will not be included in his government plans to remove housing benefit from those aged 18 to 21, or will he see 132 women abused return to their violent partners every day?
Well, I mean, I looked after women in refuge who had multiple threats on their lives and multiple attempts at their life. I looked after women whose children were so high on the risk register for social care because of the violence of their partner that was what we used to call a near miss, where them or their children may have been killed. So there are many, many cases, but every single woman I ever met living in refuge needed to be there.
By the end of this year, what would you personally like to have seen happen and changed?
I think that there needs to be a return to some of what we had previously in ring-fence budgets for supporting people. So supporting people was the financial pot of money under the last Labour government that was given to all supported housing accommodation. The system was okay. So it's not to say that we couldn't go back, because the system was okay.
After speaking to Jess, I went back to Portcullis House to speak to Conservative MP Luke Graham. I wanted to hear what he thought the government were doing right for refuge services.
The government have put in the extra 20 million, which is well recorded, to the refuges, and speaking to Women's Aid, they're very pleased that kept a number of them open. I think the logic behind ring fencing the funding sounds like a really good idea, but I do take the point that Women's Aid and others have made that if you ring fence the funding and you give it to a council and they decide to pay, they put it to elderly care rather than women's refuges, they could lose out. So I think we may need to look at further ring fencing of that fund to make sure there's a clear amount for domestic violence refuges, to make sure that is further ring fenced so it can't be spread in other areas. But like I say, that's the point of the consultation, so we can take in this feedback and the government can actually listen to concerns on the ground.
After hearing about the huge threat refuges are under, I wanted to go somewhere where the threat is all too real. Sunderland is becoming the UK's first major city to lose all refuges, and with a high domestic violence rate, this could become a matter of life or death. Cara Smith, Vice Chair of Newcastle's Women's Aid, has been following the situation and knows only too well the issues that the North East face.
And if that avenue of refuge accommodation is not available anymore, that is going to be catastrophic for women and children, because they won't have that safe haven anymore to be able to go to at the crucial point of making the decision to leave. When we know that from research that women are most at risk from domestic abuse at the point that they make the decision to leave or just after, and I suspect either it'll lead to more women staying or reconciling with abusive relationships, or women having to leave the area altogether and go to new places to access refuge accommodation. So I think that the reality is, from my experience, that if women are forced into a position where they either stay in abusive relationships or return to abusive relationships and reconcile with the perpetrator, then the reality has to be that potentially you have far more women who are at risk of domestic abuse related homicides.
These are the fears shared by many if refuges become unavailable to women across the UK. Somebody who understands this better than most is Carol. She told me about her experience of being in a refuge with 3 young children after fleeing an abusive relationship.
There's a lot of people there, do you know what I mean? There's a lot of families crushed into that one property. You know, you've got your own room, but you're sharing the kitchen, living room, things like that. And I struggled myself, just personally, you know, a lot of women like that, you know, plenty company, other women to talk to who were in the same situation. I'm quite a loner, so I struggled being around so many people type of thing. But you know how it is at the time, it was my only option. You know, I didn't have family that I could go to, not so much. If there was just me, you know, I could have went to stop somewhere, but it was a case that it was a whole family. Do you know what I mean? I couldn't just put that burden onto my mum or my sister or something like that. It was just too much for anyone. And it was just, that was our only option at the time. It was a case of that, or live where we were and put up with it. Do you know what I mean?
If you stayed where you were, do you think it would have only got worse?
It was just never ending. It was 19 years between us. I was only in my early 20s at the time. He was kicking on 40, and he just had that hold over us. He didn't have to hear us. He just had to shout. Do you know what I mean? He just that threat was always there. The threat was, it wasn't just threats against me, it was threats against my family. If I went in my family type of thing, so I was just stuck.
How difficult is it for the women that work in refuges? Because obviously times are getting very difficult, the staff are stretched, and how important are the staff for the refuges?
The staff were amazing. They were more of a friend than, you know, I didn't see them as staff. It was more friendly, you know, if we done exercise DVDs and things in the lounge on a night when the kids were in bed, they join in. You know, I had a good relationship with them, do you know what I mean?
It's clear that refuges are a vital lifeline, but I've wondered what other alternatives there are if they continue to struggle. Jess has said a lot on temporary housing and what happens to the women that end up there.
They're not being put into supportive accommodation, they're being put into the local B&B. I have seen literally faeces smeared on the wall of these hotels where they put families, vulnerable families. I went into one of the hotels in Birmingham where they house families, and there was cracks in the bathroom wall with literally dirty used condoms in there, because these places are also used as knocking shops. I once went to get a 17-year-old kid to bring her to refuge. She was staying in a hotel, and in the next room was somebody who'd been resettled who was a sex offender, and she had been sexually exploited. There's no audit, there's no standards. It's Dickensian.
What I've learned is that this is an extremely complex issue that needs to be spoken about more. Last year, 1.2 million women were affected by domestic violence, but that isn't where it ends. We need to think about what happens after they flee and what could happen to them if there's no safe place to go.
Like I say, home life is like, for a woman like the position I was in, that's all you've got. You've got your kids, you've got your house.
What I'd like to see is specifically ring-fence funding for refuges, so it was very, very clear to government and others that, you know, people can get the support they need if they need it.
I have to have assurances that that money goes to a specific and specialist standard. And without that assurance, they can do it over my dead body, frankly. The thing is, if I was murdered, people would pick up the newspapers,